Santoku, Gyuto, baby, why don't we go? If you're new to the world of Japanese kitchen knives, you have probably heard of both of these. This is a Santoku and this is a Gyuto. And they're very similar, but there's also a lot of differences. If you're considering your first Japanese kitchen knife, it's probably gonna be one of these two. But which one? Well, I imagine you've done some research online and you probably found a lot of helpful advice. You've probably also got a melted brain from all of the information overload. There's so much to know about these things, and us nerds like to really get nitty-gritty into the details. So today I'm gonna cut through all that noise. Get it? Cut through the noise, and explain it in plain English so that you can understand which of these knives you want to get first. Let's start from the basics. Japanese knives are made from harder steel than most other types of knives. That means two things. They're going to stay sharp longer, and they're going to be able to take a sharper edge and hold on to that edge. They can be a little more delicate, so you want to be a little more careful with them and treat them with some respect. Now, in terms of which one you want to get started with, both of these are going to cut essentially the same way. They're both made from nice hard steel, so they're going to keep an edge well, they're going to take a really great edge. It's really coming down to the shapes and sizes and which one of those two is going to be best for you. Let's start with a Santoku. The name Santoku translates from Japanese to three virtues. And so some of us say that slicing, dicing, mincing. I like to say it's good for meat, fish, and vegetables. Basically, it's going to do most of the jobs in your kitchen. Just not the bones and the frozen food, but all of your daily cooking. The Gyuto translates to cow sword, and it was more inspired by a French chef's knife and adapted to Japanese knife making techniques. And they named it the cow sword because they felt this longer sweeping blade has more of a meat forward bias. Now, when it comes down to it, you can use this for all the same jobs you can do with the Santoku. But the first big difference we're going to start with is size. Santokus generally come in at around 165 millimeters. That's, I think, around 5.5 inches or so. Pretty standard middle of the road chef's knife size for home cooks. A Gyuto, by comparison, usually comes in around 210 to 240 millimeters. That's closer to the 8.5 to 10 inch category, which is what you see a lot of professional chefs wielding. Right away, you might be leaning towards one or the other just based purely on size. One is likely to feel more comfortable in your hands. I'm a big guy, got big hands, and I used to work in restaurants. So a 210 to me is no big deal. And often I'll use a 240 millimeter Gyuto at home. A lot of home cooks that I know prefer something a little smaller. They may not be as comfortable with bigger knives, and so they feel a little safer and more confident using something that's this size. There's also a matter of weight to consider. Because I am tall and I've got a little more of a gravitational advantage, I like to use a lighter knife. It feels nimble and lightweight in my hand. That said, if you're a little bit smaller and you might not have that height advantage, you might actually want a bit of a heavier knife. Could be the other way around. If you're a smaller person, you might feel more comfortable with a smaller knife. Now, you would think that the smaller knife would be the lighter one, but when I'm comparing these two, the Haruki Zanpa Gyuto and the Fujimoto Hammertone Santoku, this guy is actually quite a bit heavier because there's a lot more thickness in the spine. So when you're shopping for your knife, have a look at the weights and the spine thickness. Obviously, you're not going to really know what 160 or 200 grams is going to feel like in your hand, but if you're comparing a knife to a knife and you know you tend to like lighter or heavier knives, you can use that as a great indication when you're choosing. The other really obvious difference between these two is the shape of the knife. That's why we're talking about knife shapes today. This guy, the Gyuto, has a bit more of a flat edge to it. So it's really great for people that like to make those longer sliding cuts. When I use a Gyuto, got a carrot here for an example, I'm gonna slide the knife more because I have all this length and I want to use that to my advantage. Edges tend to work best when they're sliding. When it comes to how I use the knife, you'll notice I'm actually holding the knife by the blade. This kind of grip gives you more control, but it also shortens that knife down. So if you're afraid of a bigger knife or you're trying to get used to using one, consider sliding your hand down the blade a little bit so that it makes the knife a bit smaller. Again, sliding cuts, really, really nice. Allows the blade to do all of the work for you. The Santoku has more of a curve up towards the tip, generally speaking. And so because this guy has a less flat edge, when you make those sliding cuts, you're more likely to hit the cutting board and not have the knife fully contacted. So you might end up with those little bits of vegetables that are still stuck together. You got to go back and pull them apart. We call them accordion vegetables. So when you're using a Santoku, you're going to want to integrate more of a rocking motion into your cuts. A lot of folks in the West have learned to cut purely by rocking, by leaving the tip of the knife on the cutting board and bringing it down like so. Now, if you like to cut this way, no shade, but there's a couple of reasons why I'm not a huge fan. First of all, the knife edge is made up of a bunch of tiny little teeth, and so they're going to do their job best by sliding, like I was doing with the Gyuto. Second of all, lifting your knife up like this can be dangerous. There's more potential to get your fingers under the edge because the heel of the knife is so high up. It's kind of hazardous, especially when you're working on something big like an onion or a potato or like a big head of cabbage. So even with a rocking knife, I'm still going to pick it up and use more of a sliding motion. I've just integrated a little bit of that rock so that I'm kind of getting the best of both worlds. If you are a home cook, you may have learned to hold a knife by the handle. Makes sense, right? It's the handle. You hold a hammer by the handle, you hold a saw by the handle, but this is a different kind of tool. Again, the chef's knife is going to be the safest and the most in control when you've got your hand towards the blade. So you don't need to move too far up like I did with the Gyuto, but you want to make sure that you pinch the knife sort of around the middle. It's sort of the balance point, but basically just in front of the handle. The rest of your hand can still hold the handle because it's going to work as sort of a counterbalance to the blade, but it's nice to have a little more of that forward grip. It does make the knife a bit smaller, but when you're working with something like a carrot or an onion that's not too big, it's going to be no problem. Where you might find the Santoku's curve more advantageous is when you're doing rocking cuts. That's when you're just letting the knife come down on the cutting board. Again, I prefer not to use these cuts for average everyday cooking. When I'm cutting a carrot, I don't like to lift my knife all the way up. Very awkward on my wrist. And like I said before, maybe not the best way to get the most out of your knife. That said, when you're cutting something like garlic or herbs and you're rocking the knife back and forth, this guy, again, has a really nice, beautiful, gradual curve up the blade. The Gyuto has a more subtle curve, and so you might not get quite as much of that rocking motion if you really like that. That said, if you are preferring a longer knife, I find the Gyuto rocks still very well. If I do parsley with this guy or garlic, it still does a beautiful job. Where the Gyuto is going to be an obvious winner over the Santoku is with big foods. I got a small cabbage here, and even for a small cabbage, it's almost the same size as my Santoku blade, and it's going to have a bit of a harder time cutting through this. Let's give it a try. So I'm pretty confident with knives, so I'm sure I can make this work. But if you're a home cook, you might find that you struggle a little bit to get this smaller blade through a bigger food. Most importantly, when you're cutting something that's kind of roly-poly like this, make sure you get a bit of a flat spot on the bottom. That's going to give it a more stable base to sit on, and it's less likely to slip around and be dangerous. So we're going to start with a knife, and then we're just going to gently press through. And you can see it's cutting no problem, but the knife is starting to get lost in here. If I had a really big head of cabbage, or a watermelon, or a big piece of meat, I would probably struggle a lot more. Again, comparing the Gyuto, it's so much longer than the cabbage that I don't need to rely on downward pressure. I can start back here and slide the blade more, allowing it to do more of the work. I just prefer a bigger knife for bigger jobs. If we want to actually cut this cabbage up for coleslaw, we're going to get into using some pretty different techniques with these knives. And this is one of those times it's going to hopefully illustrate which is going to be better for you depending on the way you prefer to cut. Again, with the Gyuto, we can get these nice long sliding cuts. I'm getting a little bit of a rocking motion going, but it's not too exaggerated because the blade is flatter. As I get into the taller part of the cabbage here, the knife's not getting lost. I got tons of knife and I feel very confident and in control. Let's try the Santoku. It does have enough length that I can slide, but as I get to the end here with this big chunk of cabbage, my thumb's starting to run into the cabbage. And so it doesn't have as much length as I personally would want. Now, if you do prefer to push your knife when you cut, you can do more of a sort of shaving motion with this guy, and it does work very well. The only challenge I find with this pushing motion is sometimes you get to the bottom and you're not quite disconnected, so you do this guy, right? You hear that? That's not a good sound. If you're constantly getting down to the board and then doing that, that's going to actually dull your edge and possibly even bring in some little microchips into the edge. So you want to be conscious of that. If you have maybe learned with duller knives or by really doing those rocking cuts, when you move to a Japanese knife, you're going to need to adjust your knife skills a little bit to get the most out of the knife. As I've been hammering home this whole video, sliding the knife allows the edge to do more of the work on its own. That translates to less force required. I find when I push down into the cabbage, I can get a nice thin cut, but I don't feel like I have as much control. The knife kind of skips and slides a little bit because I'm not really using it the way a knife is meant to be used. With some practice, look, beautiful thin cabbage, no problems. But it is definitely more challenging than allowing the knife to slide and do the work on its own. This length difference is really going to come into play when you've got something that really requires a sliding cut. Say you've got a nice raw salmon fillet from Costco, you want to portion it down into some individual pieces. Sawing back and forth is going to create kind of an unpleasant texture on that meat, and it's not going to be the same as if you just got a nice long sliding cut. So I prefer a Gyuto for those bigger jobs. Same goes when you're carving a turkey, right? You want a nice beautiful slice of turkey on your plate during Christmas. You don't want a whole bunch of sawed up little bits of meat. And when you have, maybe a drier meat like a turkey and you have a shorter blade, you're going to be doing a lot more of this back and forth sawing motion. You're just going to end up with a lot more of your food shredded than actually sliced. So hopefully those last two vegetables helped illustrate some of the major differences between using a Santoku and a Gyuto. To really hammer home the differences in function of these two knives, I'm going to cut up one last vegetable. This is a common one. Everybody does these. I think I use onion every single day of my life. So I'm just going to cut up an onion with a Gyuto and a Santoku. We're going to start by removing the tip and just the very root end. Then we're going to slice it in half through the root. Always leave that root intact when you're trying to dice an onion. Then we'll peel it. So first the Gyuto. We're going to score our onion horizontally so we get nice even cuts. We're going to bring it down to the edge of the board here. We're going to use the tip of the knife. Because the tip of the Gyuto is a little more narrow, you're going to get a bit less surface area contact, and I'm predicting that it'll probably glide through the onion a little more easily. Pretty smooth. Again, keep your fingers on top of the onion so they're not in the way of the blade. Then we're going to score the onion vertically. We're not cutting all the way to the back of the onion. The tip of the Gyuto is really, really nice for this. This is also a nice thin blade, which gives it a leg up. I find for denser vegetables like potatoes and onions, a thinner blade often works better. And then again, we're just going to slide the blade across. And I'm trying to use the majority of the length of the knife, right? You don't have to worry about using every single last millimeter of it, but really sliding that knife. This is a weird technique that can take some getting used to for us in the West, but it really does allow the knife to do the work on its own. Okay, beautiful. That diced up really, really cleanly. Let's see how the Santoku goes. These are obviously both really high quality knives, so I suspect they're both going to be great. But now I'm finding with the shorter blade, I got to pull my hand back a little bit as I'm scoring that onion. No big deal. No sticking, lots of control. Do one more layer. Oh yeah, clean. Awesome. Coming down, scoring the onion. Really nice, no issues. The tip on the Santoku is not quite as aggressive because it sweeps up a little more. That's not a bad thing. I just find it doesn't quite meet the cutting board as much as the tip of the Gyuto. And then, again, just kind of sliding through a little more of a rock here. You'll notice I have to lift my hand up a little more, so it's a little tougher on my wrist. But the Santoku is nice and tall, so compared to the Gyuto, I'm not getting the onions piling up over the blade as much. When it comes down to something taller like this, it's actually the Santoku that's not getting lost in the vegetable as much. As you can see, both knives perform beautifully. That's not a surprise. Both are high quality Japanese knives, beautiful steel, nice and sharp. Any good sharp knife is going to be able to do those jobs really, really nicely. Now I use both in my kitchen and I'm pretty confident with both, but when it comes down to which one you're going to choose, you might want to look back at those techniques a little bit and see which one is going to feel more natural to the way you're cutting currently. If you do have that real rocking kind of technique built into your kitchen portfolio, you're going to want to stick with a blade that probably rocks a little more and then try to slowly adjust your technique as time goes on. If you're professionally trained, or maybe you just learned to cut by sliding the knife, maybe go for more of a Gyuto shape. One of the best things about Japanese knives is when you get your first one, it gives you an opportunity to learn some knife skills. Not to say you don't have knife skills already, but when you have this really high quality, beautiful blade that you want to take proper care of, it doesn't hurt to learn some new techniques, maybe break some bad habits. We've all got them. I still have some, but it really, really helps to level up your game in the kitchen, and that in turn can get you inspired to cook more. If you want to get more in depth on how to use your knife properly, we have lots of videos on our channel, and you can even come take a class in one of our stores. So hopefully by now you have a better idea of which knife you want without getting too technical about it. If you have smaller hands, or you maybe just aren't comfortable with a bigger knife, just go for something smaller. It's going to feel great for you. A lot of the people in my life love their Santoku, and they use it every day. If you do want to get a little more adventurous in the kitchen, maybe you're trying to push your comfort zone a little bit, or you do have more experience, I would go for a 210mm Gyuto, maybe even a 240mm Gyuto. Or you can just get both. I have both in my kitchen. If you're starting your collection, you might want to go a little more broad. I do have a great video where I talked about the different shapes you want to start with, and you probably don't need both of these at the very same time. But over the years, I did add both to my collection, and I use both pretty much every day. My Santoku comes out a lot more in the morning and around lunchtime when I'm not making a big meal and maybe I just want a stainless steel knife that I can leave on the counter, get out the door. My Gyuto tends to come out when I'm preparing dinner or cooking big meals, maybe having guests over, because I'm more confident with this big blade and I get through a lot more vegetables a lot quicker. Remember, you always need one more knife. The right amount of knives is the number you have plus one. So I hope that's helped make things a little more clear as to which one of these you want to add to your collection first. But which exact knife is right for you? Well, I'm going to show you a few different variations on the Santoku and on the Gyuto so you can really hone in the exact size you want and what kind of handle you want, all these sorts of things. Let's start with the Santoku. The one I was using today is the Fujimoto Hammer Tone Santoku. Now I think this is a great knife for folks that maybe haven't had a Japanese kitchen knife before. The steel is relatively forgiving, doesn't chip as easily as some other steels. It can rust slowly, but it doesn't rust quickly the way some of the high carbon steels do. And it's a little bit more of a thick blade, so you're definitely going to want to stay away from bones and frozen food, but you can be just a little bit tougher on it as you're learning some of those good habits. It's a stunning knife. Like, just look how sexy that thing is. Gorgeous hammered finish, nice traditional Japanese handle. And I find this Japanese handle puts more of the weight in the blade. So this guy has a real forward balance, we would say, which means, in my opinion, the knife's going to go through the food more on its own, and I'm lazy, so I like that. Say you're more comfortable with a knife that has a heavier handle. Now these full tang riveted handles, let's be honest, they're a little over-engineered. You don't need a handle this sturdy on a kitchen tool, especially not a knife. But if you like to have more of the weight of the knife in your hand, that's what these are going to offer. They're also very classic looking, so if you have a more traditional kind of Western European aesthetic, you might just prefer this. This is the Haruki Goma. I do really like this one. It's a little longer, it's 180 millimeters. So if you're thinking the Santoku is a great shape, but maybe a little short for you, this guy just adds on like half an inch or so. It's a really, really nice multi-purpose size. If you want something a little heavier and a little more rugged, the Tojiro DP is a great choice. These guys are really kind of plain Jane, but I don't think that's a bad thing. They're great if you're just moving out into your first apartment, or if you're getting a job in a kitchen and you want a knife that kind of just blends in and doesn't look too conspicuous. This guy's a great choice. Nice and rugged, again, 165 millimeters, great size, more of that weight in the handle. This guy actually has quite a bulky handle compared to a lot of Japanese knives. So if you do have the big hands like me, I think you're really gonna like this handle. In Gyuto land, there's a lot more diversity in terms of shapes and sizes of knife. The 210 millimeter Gyuto, like I said, it's around 8.5 inches or so. It's, I would say, the most popular choice. It's one of the most versatile, especially if you're a home cook or you haven't used a really big knife before. This is a great size and shape. This Haruki Zampa is one of my current favorites. It's very thin and light, so if you want a knife that feels like you're wearing nothing at all, then you're gonna love this knife. If you want a little more weight in your knife, just go for this Western style handle. It's definitely weightier in the hand, but a lot of the blades are still nice and light, so they're not too bulky and too heavy. There are options out there too if you want something that's like a real tank of a knife. Speaking of which, we're moving up a size. 240 millimeter Gyuto. It introduces a little more than an extra inch. So if you are getting into those big heads of cabbage, watermelon, or again, you're just really tall like me and you like a big knife that fits into your big hands, you're gonna really like this guy. Again, I sneak my hand up on it, so it really shortens down the length of the knife. And then if I need the full length of the knife, I just sneak my hand back. This is a knife from Kamo-san. Despite being more of a Japanese style, there's a fair bit of weight in the handle. They have a fairly thick blade. So if you want a knife that feels a little more like a beast when you're chopping with it, this guy is gonna be that knife. If you gotta chop up like 20 pounds worth of coleslaw in a professional kitchen, this guy's gonna fly through it, no problem. And then we're getting to the ridiculous knives. When I first went to cooking school, the big Austrian chef told me that I needed at least a 10-inch kitchen knife, if not a 12-inch kitchen knife. I'll be honest, I didn't use it all that much, but if I had one this pretty, I probably would have. This is a 270 millimeter Gyuto. They even come bigger. Sometimes you can get a 300 millimeter Gyuto, and it's a really, really fun size. Let's be honest, it's probably not the first Japanese kitchen knife you're gonna get, or the second or the third, but if you end up being a bit of a collector like myself, why not have something big and crazy like this? You can show off to your friends, you know, you can paddle your canoe down the river if you need to. Maybe don't wave it around so haphazardly like me, but it is a really great fun size. I think a knife this big is just a joy to use. And they come a little smaller too. You can get a Gyuto that's 180 millimeters or 150 millimeters. Those are great little kind of prep utility knives, and they're less common these days, but they're out there if you're looking for them. For me, if I had to pick one Gyuto for the rest of my life, it would be a 240 millimeter Gyuto. It's super versatile. I rarely find that I need a longer knife than that, but I do find that sometimes I'm using a smaller knife and I need to put it down and pick up a bigger knife. So for me, a little bit bigger is better. For the average home cook, you might just go with the 210 and you're gonna love it. Before we go, let's give an honorable mention to the bunka and kiritsuke. We'll have a video on these guys soon, but they are sort of cousins to the Santoku and Gyuto. The bunka was actually invented first. I believe this was made around the 1950s when Japan was really modernizing, and they invented this because bunka means culture, and they wanted a knife that kind of represented the new culture of Japan. They even had what they called bunka apartments for people moving into the city. And so this is a really cool little shape, functionally pretty much identical to the Santoku, but it does have a more badass cut-off tip, which I really, really like. This guy is a kiritsuke, more accurately a kiritsuke Gyuto. The name bunka and kiritsuke don't just refer to shapes, they actually refer to the tip style. So you can get a kiritsuke petty or nikiri, or in this case, Gyuto. Functionally not much different than a Gyuto in this case, but you do get kiritsuke Gyutos that have a flatter belly and are more designed for those sliding cuts that people like me really like. If you want to learn more about those, subscribe to the channel so you can catch the videos we do about them in the future. So let me know, which one of these are you gonna get? Or do you have both of them already? Again, I think you really do need both in your kitchen, but starting with one of these and adding a smaller petty knife is gonna help you get 90% of the jobs done in your home kitchen. If you wanna learn more about these functionally, maybe you've already got one, you wanna master it, or you wanna really dial in on which technique is gonna be best for you, check out my buddy Mike. He did 2 videos, one where he shows you how to use a Gyuto with a bunch of different skills, and another one that's the exact same thing, but with the Santoku. Santoku, Gyuto, baby, why don't you go? We're good.